Welcome to the IR Global podcast. IR Global is the largest international professional services network. I'm your host of the IR Digital podcast, Jennifer Riggins. Today is the second in a three-part series we are doing with guest Jessica Brown-Wilson, talking about the Me Too movement and all too present sexual harassment in the workplace. We'll be reflecting almost 2 years later on if anything's changed, and particularly the modern view we take on the human resources and employee law around it. Last month, on our most popular episode to date, I don't know if you knew that, Jessica, but she gave you tips on how to create a sexual harassment policy that actually fosters and enforces a safer workplace culture. You can go and listen to it, and you should, at www.irglobal.com/news, where you found this podcast, /IR-digital. So that's irglobal.com/news/IR-digital. And then you will find there both this podcast and the previous episode that you definitely should. Today, we're deep diving into how to treat your employees, shock me, like humans, even if you're disciplining and terminating them. So we're talking about a lot of awkward stuff, but a lot of really important stuff, and part of pretty much everyone's life and their work life cycle at some point has lost a job, or if you're in a management role or position of power or privilege, maybe you've gotten rid of someone's job. So let's talk about how to be human. So to start, for folks who haven't met you before, Jessica, tell us about your work with employment law.
Sure. I am a partner at Fisher Broyles, and my expertise and the majority of what I do is I deal with employment law. I primarily represent businesses and the management side, so I help in drafting policies and sorting out these sticky issues related to termination or discipline or disability or discrimination. And then in the unfortunate circumstance when a company gets sued, I also represent them in the litigation.
Okay, so that's very interesting because you seem very supportive of the employee side, but also of the employer side, and I don't think that's the stereotype of a corporate lawyer at all, so that's very welcome. So let's start.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, no, it's from I come from a place of really wanting the companies to do the right thing. So
that's good, and that's important, and more lawyers need to be that way, or maybe that is the truth and the stereotype is just a myth. So hopefully there are more like you. So let's actually start with the end. Terminations. Dun, dun, dun. When we spoke about this episode, you said that everything in these situations is about limiting legal risk, which is important, but that you need to let people leave with dignity. How do they do that in such an awkward situation?
Well, there are a couple ways. I would say the most important things when you're terminating someone and letting them leave with dignity, the first thing is to have empathy. I would say the second thing is to be respectful and show respect and honor. And then the third kind of goes along with empathy, but it's just the realities of what does this person need, and I'm really speaking about money. If you're terminating someone, they're going from one day of, expecting a certain amount of money that's coming in on a regular basis, and then all of a sudden that's going to change and there's no money coming in. So how is that going to affect them, and what do they, literally need to make it through the next 2 to 4 weeks?
Now, why don't you tell me more about empathy here?
Being empathetic is important, and it informs your actions and your choice around the whole situation. And really, the way that you say goodbye means everything. It means everything to the departing employee. It means everything to the employees that are staying, because they're going to see how you're treating this person. It defines you as a company, as a leader. So, when you're crappy and you just leave someone, kind of throw them out to the wolves, Or are you someone that's kind as possible under the circumstances, because this is probably, losing your job is probably one of the most vulnerable situations we can be in as humans. So with empathy, really just considering what it's like for this person, the realities of, do they have children? Do they have dependents? What is going to be the consequences or the effects when they stop getting paid from your company? And that will help you kind of understand, just to better understand them and anticipate what their needs may be and how you could potentially help them with those needs on the way out.
And I guess this definitely varies versus if someone's not the right fit for a role, or there's been some sort of disagreement that lets them go, versus if there's some sort of downsizing in the company.
Sure. I mean, everything, with terminations, it would be a case-by-case basis. I guess in my mind, I'm thinking, when you have to let someone go, either a downsizing or even if it's, discipline or performance related, I still think there's a way to do it with kindness. If it's egregious misconduct, it may take it into a different realm where it's a very short conversation and there's not a whole lot of empathy. But I think even in that situation, there's a way to be respectful to someone on the way out, even if they've done something that's, very horrible or they've hurt someone else. There's a way to say goodbye that's respectful, that can just set the tone of the environment for your company.
In the trend of open work floor plans and even cubicles, where is the best place to do a termination conversation? And should it be recorded? Like, does that help with liability in the company or no?
I would say it should never be recorded, just because we may say something that we shouldn't say. In a termination conversation.
Could that person be recording it nowadays? If people assume they might be fired, I assume that must happen.
It can, depending. In the U.S., it's a state-by-state consideration on the consent for recording. So in Texas, I'm licensed in Texas, for example. As long as one party has consent to record, you can record a conversation. There are other states that you have to have dual consent. So it depends. Yes, it is likely that the employee could be recording the conversation. So that's actually a really good thought to have, just to kind of keep you in check and accountable for what you're saying. What I usually tell, like the super legal professional advice I would give on a termination is, I give some soft coaching, but you want to keep the conversation pretty short and to the point, because it's uncomfortable and it's vulnerable, and it's not good for anyone to have a long, drawn out, I would say, emotional rehashing of events. In the situation of an open floor plan, well, any termination should always be done behind closed doors. You should never do it where someone else could hear or see what's going on, because that's just part of the giving the departing employee respect and dignity. Like I said, I mean, this is one of the most, I would say, culturally, shameful, embarrassing, vulnerable situations you could be in, and you really want to make sure that they're not on display. If you have choice of where you have it, I would say, think about how the employee is going to leave the room. Are you going to pack their things? Are they going to go back to their desk and pack their things? Is there a conference room that's near the side door where they could just leave, if they're feeling emotional or upset or whatever? I think that would be best. And, offering, we can discreetly pack up your things and deliver them to your house, because what happens is some people, the boss will call them into a conference room, they'll terminate them, and then they'll walk them back to their desk, like parade them in front of all their coworkers and tell them to gather their things. And that's just humiliating. And I wouldn't.
Sounds punitive. Yeah. Like you can't be
Yes.
trusted. So what you're saying is most of the time it's not with notice, or maybe if the company's downsizing, you might be like, you have a month, you have a week, or is that not beneficial at that point because that 2 weeks notice, like that time has been severed, so it's better to just give them those vacation days, or what?
So most of my answers are always, it depends. I would say in the U.S., when we're doing what I would call a termination, like an involuntary, we're ending your employment, unless it's a layoff, we call, a reduction in force. There's a lot of people that are being laid off. Then by law, you have to give certain notice. Otherwise, typically it's, they probably didn't know it was coming, or they didn't know it was coming today. I mean, there may have been, discipline and a lead up, but usually it's done. There's not a lot of warning, especially if you're terminating for performance or, some kind of misconduct. The thought is, you don't give them a lot of time to think about it, because potentially they could do things that are harmful, or, try to steal intellectual property. So that's kind of the other thought of, while it may not be the most kind thing to do to surprise someone, for business reasons, usually that's the way it's done, just so that the business can make sure that it, all of its electronic and digital intellectual property is protected. And you're considering the safety of other people, because when people know they're getting fired, it brings out a lot of emotions and anger and frustration that could also go sideways.
Is there also on the other side an intellectual property right of the person getting fired? Like, I assume we use, say you have a work phone, you probably use it with you have your WhatsApp on there, you have probably your private email, or even your WhatsApp on your computer, things like that. How is that taken care of or considered at all? Because suddenly you have access, probably people log in everything and use the same passwords for everything.
So a company that's, I would say, well organized and kind of dots their I's and crosses their T's, there should be inside the handbook a policy that addresses all of this. So work computers there should be notice that if it's your work computer, it's the company's property, and you don't have any right of privacy on the company property. So usually in that situation, access would just be cut off on a work computer if you've got that language. And I say that because it's really necessary on the other side, for the company side, to protect the intellectual property. I mean, everyone knows that you have a work laptop or a work computer, you're doing some personal stuff on it.
Of course,
but you're really not supposed to. But you're not supposed to be.
But if you're traveling for work, you would Skype your family, things like that.
Sure.
It would be absurd to carry two computers for that purpose.
With phones, I mean, I can, if the device is the property of the company, then the company, gets it back. I know when I left my prior firm, what the policy is basically they wipe it clean, which is really inconvenient, because you have, you've got all your personal contacts and everything on there, but they literally take the device and wipe it clean. And then they're like, oh, you can have the device. But they want to make sure that you're not taking any intellectual property with you. So there are different ways to handle it, depending on the business. I mean, some businesses, the intellectual property that may be on a tablet or a phone might not be that important, but I would say, it's really something to consider, because if you're involuntarily terminating someone, they're motivated to go somewhere and make money. They may be angry. So you want to make sure that you're controlling, your important resources,
And
if you've got customer lists.
Data has as much
Exactly.
value as blood or gold now. So that's definitely important to think about. And especially with GDPR, the California Privacy Act, things like that, it's significant if you have that data and being able to map what you do with data if someone is terminated. I think at least in Europe and GDPR is part of that. And I assume because California is supposed to be even harsher, you have to somehow map that out or something. Wow.
Right.
So you also talked about respect and honor. Does that just mean not cussing people out, or?
I would say, at the point that you've made the decision that you're parting ways. When I say respect and honor, there's no reason to tell them, 15 ways that they sucked at their job when you're terminating them. I think, I always recommend it's just a really short conversation. I'm sorry, but this isn't going to work out. This is your last day of employment here. Just be respectful. Like, there's no reason to say, have a laundry list of all the things that you messed up and you did this wrong and you did that wrong and you made this person upset. So when I say be respectful, yes, in your words, but also just the overall tone of the conversation to keep it respectful and professional.
Should it be like a Friday afternoon? Seems to be, as it's Friday afternoon, at least in London where I'm taping it, it seems to be the witching hour.
Yes, I would say Friday afternoon is a popular time, depending on the circumstances. Sure. Sometimes it has to be a Monday. But that's why I said it's really important to kind of map out the geography of your office and where you're doing it and where they're going to leave. And, just take into account, is everyone going to lunch at the same time that they're going to be walking out the door, so that people would see them or gossip about it or something like that. Just kind of to think about all of those circumstances. Sometimes something comes up and you need to do it in the middle of a day on a Wednesday. But I would say overall, usually it happens at the end of the week on an afternoon, so that, I don't know, there's just something a little easier about, they were going to leave on a Friday anyway. And, it's like closure at the end of the week.
And less people in the office usually. So that definitely helps.
Right.
Should it always be in person?
To the extent possible, I would say yes.
But also in writing, I presume you also want to have them sign something in that moment, or you want to be emailing them something, or what?
I think really in person, just for the human aspect, it's something it's a really vulnerable circumstance. And I think that's part of the respect, is looking someone in the eye and just saying, I'm really sorry, but this didn't work out and we're going to have to part ways. Nowadays, so much of the workforce is remote, so that's not always possible. So I would say, if you have to terminate someone that's remote and it's not possible to have an in-person conversation, the next best thing would be either a video call or a call, so that you're actually, communicating. The worst would be just a cold email or a cold letter.
It's like a text for a breakup, not nice.
Right.
Or leave a voicemail, not nice for either types of breakup.
Exactly. And obviously terminating an employment, there's going to be some follow-up paperwork and documentation, either in the mail or via email, but that shouldn't be the only communication. I feel like, you owe that person the respect of telling them first, before you just send a cold email that says, this is your last day.
Something that I find is very important to me, and I think is very interesting if a company is trying to really work on culture, is the exit interview. How does that play in a termination versus someone leaving? How many of your clients or companies in general actually do an exit interview, especially if someone quits and gives notice, so there's time for it?
Right. I think exit interviews are a great idea for when the employee is voluntarily quitting. I don't think enough companies utilize that resource because it really gives you an insight as to what's going on. I mean, there's a reason, right, while they're leaving. And I would say, using these same principles of honor and dignity and respect and treating them like a human, really trying to understand why they're leaving, because at the end of the day, that affects your bottom line. Retention is important. And, every time you lose an employee, you've got extra costs tacked on to, recruiting and retraining and, just reacclimating a new person into the business.
Yeah, I think it's similar to the customer idea that it's 4 times more expensive to hire a new employee than to retain your old one, same with keeping a customer. A statistic I've heard across the board, but I never have the citation of, so I'm giving that caveat, is that 89% of organizations think people leave for money, while only 12% of people do. So I really think exit interviews need to happen, especially when you're talking about diversity and inclusion. It's a good way to find out especially if you have a person of color or gender minority, woman, or anything that's a minority that is leaving, you especially want to talk to them, because at least in the tech marketplace, it's not just that they're not hiring women of color and minorities, it's that they're not able to keep them because there's cultural issues of inclusion. So that's like super important for that area of inclusion for sure.
No, absolutely. And I think the next layer is who is doing your exit interviews, because that really matters. I mean, just like the person is leaving for a reason, if you've got, the jerk old guy, that's the reason that they are leaving, is the one doing the exit interview, they're not going to tell them what's really going on. So I think, really taking a look at who the person is and who would be the best fit to conduct that interview. I mean, obviously you don't just want to throw anyone in there, but I think it's important to have, if you theoretically an HR person, but, hopefully someone that's really trained and sophisticated in dealing with diversity and inclusion issues, that a departing employee would feel comfortable actually telling them. And the person asking the question and conducting the interview is comfortable with that vulnerable conversation, because it's vulnerable. To get the truth, you're going to have to ask some tough questions. But I think that's really important if companies want to improve and do better.
Also, it turns out for a lot of people across the board that the reason they actually leave companies is not money. It's either lack of ability to grow, or more likely they don't like their boss. So that's important to feedback to have, because you're retaining someone that's probably more expensive because they're someone's manager, and people are leaving because of them. So that's definitely important. So let's get to that third part, the reality of money for the departing employee, and like, how much severance should you pay? Does everyone pay severance? Do you legally have to pay severance? I guess like as you get further up in a company, that's part of your contract more, things like that.
Well, the short answer is, unless there's a contract that requires severance, then companies are not required to pay severance. And the instances where there's a contract that requires severance, that's usually C-suite, that's CEOs, CFOs, COOs. So the vast majority of people do not have an agreement that that guarantees severance. And so the reality, I always advise clients, offer severance. I mean, it's just a win-win for everyone. And I know most people, when you're terminating someone because of performance or misconduct, the company is usually frustrated and angry, and the last thing they want to do is give what they consider a bad actor. They don't want to reward them or give them money. But I would say, sometimes you have to set that aside and just look at the reality of this person is, as of today, there's no more income coming to them, and there's no more health insurance. They may have multiple dependents. I mean, depending on what their circumstances are, like the reality of their life, what is it going to be like tomorrow? What are they going to be worrying about? Paying for, are they paying for their parents? Are they paying for daycare? Does their spouse have a disability? I mean, what is the sticking point? What's going to cause them difficulty? And so I say always offer them severance. Is there a magic number? Not really.
Usually seems to be about 1 month's salary, or is that true?
I would say, I always tell people you want to find the number that's the lowest number that they will accept. And I know that's really vague. I would say roughly around 1 month is usually, sometimes it's 2 months, sometimes it's 6 weeks. But you want it to be enough of a carrot that the person is accepting it. So the other side of this is, in exchange for this money, this severance, you would require them to sign a release and waiver of liability. And that's really significant. I think companies don't understand how valuable that is. I like to think of it, it's almost like insurance, right? You pay a little bit, you pay a premium on the front end to protect you in case, something really bad happens, and it's, expensive. So, when you have an employee leaving, you're paying a few $1,000s at the departure, but you're getting peace of mind and assurance that there's not going to be a 6 or 7 or 8 figure litigation. When you say goodbye to them, it's actually, the book is closed and it's a goodbye.
When people then refuse to sign, they're still fired, right? They can't just say no, unless it's obviously a negotiation for downsizing, or there is something like they want to move you to a new role, or severance. That's a little different. That's a safer, calmer handoff. But in a situation when someone's like, no, I'm not going to sign that. Maybe their partner's a lawyer. Maybe it's at a law firm.
Sure. So yeah, they never have to sign it. The way it looks when you terminate someone and you're giving them severance, first is the communication of, this isn't working out, we're going to have to part ways, today is your last day of employment here. So the termination is done. And then like the next sentence or two, I would suggest being, we want to be as generous as possible. And, we appreciate your time here. We're offering you this severance. And then you hand them the agreement, or, hand it to them. Depending on the age of the employee, if the employee is 40 or older, by law, they have up to 21 days to consider any type of severance agreement or offer. So you can't force them to sign it right then. I advise, even if they're under 40, never pressure them. I usually tell clients, I put it in the agreement, even if they're less than 40, give them 7 days to consider it, because you don't want to look like you're coercing them to sign something. It should be, a mutual assent, mutual agreement.
That's shocking, though, to me. That sounds very ageist and discriminatory, that someone over 40 gets more benefits in that way. Is it well, I assume the reason it exists is because they're less hireable, but which is stupid as well, but it's a fact.
I mean, it's the federal statutes written in to protect from age discrimination because, you know, historically, right, people that are older would get fired and, you know, they would be handed a document offering them severance and felt pressured to like sign it right then. So this was kind of the, you know, our legislature's response to that of, you know, if you're 40 or older, you know, by law, you have certain protections. You get to consider it for up to 21 days. And you can also, after you sign it, if you change your mind, you have 7 days to revoke it. So, you know, while there aren't the same statutory requirements for employees that are under 40, I always advise to give more or less, maybe not the same amount of days, but definitely give them time to really consider it.
It just sounds like you're being a good human then, logically speaking. So let's do the other side of it, the hiring point. And it brought up something that I never thought of before, because I guess it's kind of a negative way to start at a company, but for women in tech, it seems really logical, who are broed out of, because of culture, broed out of jobs and things like that. Someone who's not in a C-suite role, should they be negotiating, especially again in tech, these are in demand roles. These are, so you have more power, but of course it could be in any role where someone has great value or, you know, is great perceived value, things like that. Should you be trying to negotiate in the contract that you have severance?
It depends on the demand. I would say for the most part, if you're not making, you know, six figure, I'll just throw out a threshold of six figures. If you're below six figures, a company is probably just going to shake their head and say no thanks, right? If you're trying to negotiate severance in an agreement, just because it's not required. You know, the flip side is it depends on how much in demand you are, you know, how specialized your skills are, how committed they are to you and your skill set. So, I mean, yes, everything's negotiable, but I want the listeners to know that, you know, if you're making $45,000 and, you know, let's use the example, you know, you're a coder, trying to negotiate severance at the front end of an employment relationship is probably not going to be successful, I would say.
The messed up part of it is someone with six figures probably has much more of a cushion than someone who's making $45,000 a year, which isn't that far above the poverty line in the US. So it's interesting to me, again, with the termination side, that we as employees usually have to give some sort of notice, but we don't have to receive notice or money to fill that time as employed, which is, by the way, very different in Europe. It's much harder to fire people in Europe. It is much more expensive to fire people, but also you do get severance. You do get ample notice, unless obviously there could be a situation where people are like, we're starting that severance time now, or they'll somehow factor your vacation days in or something, if something like extreme happens. But everyone's unionized because it's just a different type of union. It's not based on your job type or anything like that. So it's just very interesting and different. But I believe you're licensed in both Texas and California, right?
Yes.
How is it that different at all? Because we look at California as the European state. Are there different protections for people, whether it's because of their gender, race, ethnicity, they're pregnant, when they lose their job? Is there certain protections or certain benefits they get, or is there better access to, well, COBRA is a federal providing of healthcare when you lose your job, but how does that work?
Well, I would say California is is like a little European state inside the U.S. It's slightly different, though. There's no requirement for severance. But I would say if you're a business in California and you're firing an employee, you should always, always, always offer severance, because the laws are so employee friendly. And the culture is such that if you're involuntarily terminating someone, they will likely get a lawyer and they will likely sue you. So the difference is, Texas is a much more conservative, business friendly state. And the laws are just not as favorable, to protect employees. So, across the board, I advise companies to offer severance, but it's much more, I would say it's much more important in California, just because the laws are stronger, with respect to pregnancy, disability, everything, gender, race, ethnicity. Something else you said that I just kind of want to touch on is really, I was talking about kind of the human side of the realities of the person that you're terminating, but you also need to consider the protected class or the status they have. So if you're firing a woman, if you're firing a gender or racial minority, if you're firing someone who, is of a particular religion, or if someone has a disability or perceived disability, those all need to be factored in. And, those factors, I would say, have value, right? So if the person fits into one of those categories, it's much more likely, and depending on the facts, but it's more likely that they could have a legitimate claim against the company. So it's kind of like you just got to kind of weigh all of the factors, and that should go into play when you're deciding how much severance to offer.
And I guess, like a friend of mine, I've got multiple friends that have notified that they're pregnant and still get fired. Factor in, I would assume that woman will be factoring in to her expected severance package also an extra 4 months on there because of maternity leave and the fact that she's showing and is less likely to get a job. Not that I have a friend who got a job at 7 months pregnant recently and still had maternity leave, but that is a company to be touted, not the norm, sadly.
Yes. I actually just this week, it was a client that I haven't worked with before, but they have offices all over the U.S. and they had an employee in California who is pregnant. She's on bed rest. She had already, she'd already used all of the statutory mandated leave. And the question I got was, so do we fire her? And,
I understood under the Family Leave Act, you have the ability for like an extra year unpaid to keep your job, right? Can you be fired?
So, sometimes people are, we try to do the best we can. A lot of times some HR people are just so technical in the FMLA gives you this much and the California Family Rights Act gives you this much time. But the truth is, as a company, you can always extend the amount of unpaid leave, right? That's what I told them in this situation. I'm like, it's the worst thing and the most unkind thing I can imagine that you've got a woman that's 7 months pregnant on bed rest and you're asking me if you're going to terminate her employment. Absolutely not. You're not going to terminate her. I said, we'll just figure out a way to put her, on extended unpaid leave. And, it doesn't fit in, even if they've extended their FMLA or whatever, there are ways to be, it's not costing anything to the company, right, to have her on unpaid leave.
And it's called human resources. the human part. They're not resources.
So, I mean, that's just one example that happened this week that I was like, oh my goodness.
I guess
You know,
also besides legal and moral retribution, karma will get you. But also we live in a world of social media and websites like Glassdoor where you can review. And I certainly, if I was working for a company of 50 or more people, I would be checking out their Glassdoor reviews. And if I saw that, no effing way would I ever consider that workplace. And it could flag you for an investigation, even if that individual doesn't. But also that's the type of stuff that will go viral. She could sell an interview, things like that. And good on her.
Exactly. And I just thought that was a good, example of the person that I was talking to. They weren't being mean or malicious. They were just being very precise and trying to understand the rules. But I think sometimes you have to like step back and just consider the overall circumstances. Like, okay, you're trying to just apply, what the minimum, the law is what the minimum you have to do. And, I think about this person, like, they've worked for you. They've given you service for months or years or whatever, and they're in a situation where they're really ill or on bed rest. I would think that it would never be the answer to fire someone when they're ill or,
It's crazy. Are they also providing her with health care during that time period?
I am not sure.
Okay.
We actually
I was
supposed to have a
just
follow-up
curious.
call today.
Because that seems, as a pregnant person, having to go on COBRA or Obamacare when mid-pregnancy, like, that's scary. That would be terrifying, obviously. And I've had friends, again, that lose their job. And then COBRA can be much more expensive than what you were paying before, for sure. So
it's usually double or triple what you've been paying sometimes, depending on the amount the
Yeah, it's crazy. Something I was thinking of before, because you said you should keep it as quick as possible, the termination. Maybe this is just me, but I would ask why. How do you answer that? Can you legally answer that? Or is that something that would come up if there is more of a legal dispute regarding it?
My advice to keep it short is more with me on the attorney hat, reducing risk and liability. So, thinking worst case scenario, this person doesn't sign a severance agreement, they could potentially sue you. So you want to make sure that you are consistent, like, hopefully you have documented the performance or the issues that this employee has, and all the documents are consistent and clear. So keeping that conversation short, just it's on the liability and the risk side is cleaner. A lot of employees do ask why, depending on the circumstances. I usually coach people to maybe, a short answer. If it's been an ongoing concern of performance, just having a really short answer. If it's, a one big, like, horrible misconduct event, I think you can just, as we had a situation on Monday, September 27th, and that violates our policy, and we're going to have to let you go. Like, just something that's really kind of short and succinct and not rehashing facts.
Wow, it's just a crazy conversation that we definitely got into the termination side. So I have to ask you the flip side. How do you hire people like a human? How do you make it so that, what can you do, especially legally or human resourcely, in the process that can help avoid that termination at the end, or can help make everything better, because it's often the human resources person maybe only dealing with that person those 2 times.
So the hiring as a human is tricky because under the law, there are certain prohibitions on, you can't just have the normal conversation. You can't ask questions you might normally ask if you were just, talking to someone. You've got to be careful on the business side, that you're not asking questions that's trying to elicit, does the person have children? Are they married? What religion are they? So it's tricky on that side. On the other part of it, I think just being a really good conversationalist and engaging the prospective employee to the point where they feel comfortable. So if the employee is sharing information without being specifically asked, then I think you're having, a more of a human conversation. And then the other part is knowing, communicating the benefits and the culture of a company, which, may be important to that person. So, if you've got flexible Fridays, you can work from home or something like that, to me, that would be important to anyone and everyone, but just communicating the culture so that the person can understand they're not there just to, pound out whatever it is, pound out pages.
I guess also it just has to be encouraging them to ask questions. I think, first of all, from someone like, when I'm in an interview, I find I'm most successful by turning it on them and asking a lot of questions, because that also shows your domain knowledge. But just making sure that people can ask a lot of questions of the company, not time limiting the conversation as well, especially if you're getting to the point of you're about to hire or things like that. Being honest, I would say, about if the role is not new, what happened to the previous person? How should you be honest? How legally honest can you be?
I like honesty, and, you don't want to get too detailed because they can figure out who that person is, right? So you don't want to get too detailed and talking about, something they messed up or they weren't able to perform or, they weren't able to meet expectations, because then you could potentially have like a defamation situation on your hands. If for some reason, with lawyers, we're always trying to help clients think of worst case scenarios. So if the prospective employee somehow reaches out to the former employee and says, oh, in the interview, they said A, B, C, and D about you, you probably want to be a little bit careful. So honesty, but I would, have some, I would say be honest about the role and the demands and the reality, and not get too much into what the person before them did or didn't do.
And with LinkedIn, you can bet people can easily find who was in the previous role before you, and they can ask them. And if you have an honorary employee, they will tell you. So let's end. I definitely want to just give the tips to the listeners that are in the employee side, that always ask why that role is open. That should be a question you ask, because that is something you want to know. It also tells you a lot how companies respond about things like that, how companies respond if you ask about, evidently, all recent female computer science graduates ask if there's some sort of women in tech community at the company, what they're doing. So be prepared to answer those questions and be prepared to ask them. Don't be shy about it. And then just something logistically we talked about from the beginning. I always tell, because like I do LinkedIn profiles on the side, and when I talk to people about like job coaching, which is not my job at all, it's just somehow that's something I do with people, as I lightweight on the side coach my friends and people I know with job coaching, is that keep a work journal and your CV. It's fine, because you're going to use again, you're not supposed to, but everybody's going to use the work computer for personal. Either keep that stuff in your personal email, or like in a Google Doc that you created in your personal Google Doc. It's fine to share if you want to have a work journal because that preps you for other interviews and stuff. But you need to be prepared to, and don't keep pictures. Like, just don't keep pictures on your work accounts. Like things, if you're going to lose it, these are priceless things. The only copy of your CV or resume is a priceless thing, especially when you need it most of all, or photos of your child. And also, maybe you don't want them to have those photos. So don't do that. Just be careful about segregating yourself data-wise, but also just make sure to cover your butt and make sure you have it. So that was just something I was thinking about from the beginning, that just make sure. I think it's important as an employee to also journal things, even just for yourself. And maybe you have a literal journal, but I guess a lot of people don't. But if something happened, that might come up in your performance appraisal or something. Like, you want to be able to advocate for yourself and find it when you need it in case things disappear.
That's a really great advice. I don't know that I've ever heard it because, just kind of keeping real time, whether it's once a week, once a month, it can be valuable in a lot of different ways, whether it's your annual review or, having conversation with someone about a new job prospect. You have like some details of, something that you did that you can talk about.
Always be ready to answer your STAR interview questions about what you've done in different things. And then just in the mention of annual review, if you're an employer listening, please don't just do annual reviews. Everyone feels like they're in the principal's office. No one on either side feels comfortable with it. And it's not that useful because you're talking about something potentially 11 months ago. So do one-on-ones regularly. Do things that you're keeping in touch, or having an open door policy as human resources, that someone's uncomfortable with something. Don't let it explode till you have the point of termination. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Jessica. I can't wait for our next conversation, and I know the listeners can't wait either, so we'll definitely have to schedule that when we get off the line. This was great. It's obviously a really uncomfortable topic, even for you who helps all these companies. I'm sure a lot of people are really awkward when you talk to them about it because no one wants to do it.
Yes. It's definitely uncomfortable, but kind of just have to put your, what they say, put your big girl panties on and be courageous and have have these tough, vulnerable conversations.
And be
and
empathetic.
I love what you said about, have the conversations before it's a termination. If you're managing people, or if you're a leader or you're managing people, the first time that something comes up that doesn't work for you, like, talk about it, because, people can be coached, if you communicate what's not working. I think that's a big takeaway.
And make sure that people on your team know who to talk to as well, because it might be something you as a boss are not aware of, or maybe the boss is the problem. They need to know the point person in HR to talk to, especially when you're talking about very self-independent teams and tech and things like that. Maybe someone is a problem and you don't know because you're not there at that time. So make sure people know who to talk to and that they're open to be able to talk to on both sides of the fence. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Jessica.
you.
These IR Digital podcasts are meant to be an educational resource from experienced lawyers like Jessica, accountants, and financial advisors with extensive knowledge on topics you as professionals need to know about. To learn more about IR Digital and its services, please visit irglobal.com. If you found this episode useful, give us a rating, top rating. Give us a share. I think this is something that's useful for a lot of people on both sides of this awkward conversation. So I do think this will be a really useful one. And we all know someone in one of these sides of the situation right now. It's a fact of life. So Jessica, if our listeners want to touch base with you and learn more about you, Fisher Boyles, and in employment law, sexual harassment law in general, maybe their company going through this awkward process, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Email is always great and easy. It's jessica.riggins fisherbroyles.com, FISHERB as in boy, ROYLES.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much.